Assalamu alaikum. So today, inshallah, we'll be talking about quite an interesting topic. This will be a basic introduction to pacemakers. We'll be handling this topic from the point of view of temporary pacing in the settings of the perioperative period. So we're not talking about permanent pacing, we're not talking about transvenous pacing. So essentially, patients who do cardiac surgery and require pacing, how should we deal with these? And to understand the basic concepts around it and basic troubleshooting. So we'll be giving a quick overview over the basic principles that are required to go through the rest of the topic. And then the core talk about today will be about the pacemakers. Mainly, we'll be talking about different modes. So what are the advantage and disadvantage of each mode, and when to choose which mode. And then, so we go quickly about the concept of output, sensitivity, how to adjust the setting of the pacemaker, and basic troubleshooting. So let's start. Before I start, I want to just ensure that you know that I'm a surgeon. So you should not fully trust everything you hear today, okay? So just, that's an important thing to mention. Quickly going over basic principles. So what are the properties of cardiac cells? Excitability, which means if a cardiac cell gets a stimulus, this generates action potential. Okay, so this is excitability. But also, what's quite peculiar about cardiac cells are that even if they do not get a stimulus, they are able to generate action potential on their own. So this is automaticity. So two ways to get action potential: either being stimulated by a stimulus, and then the cardiac cell will respond by generating action potential. This is excitability. And if it does not get an external stimulus, it has the capability of generating action potential on its own, maintaining a rhythm. We call that automaticity. So any cell that gets an action potential, either being stimulated from outside or generating on its own, will be able to conduct that action potential to nearby cells. And so it will be able to transfer and be the stimulus for the nearby cells. And then the nearby cells, since they are excitable, they will also get an action potential and then conduct, and you keep going on. So excitability, automaticity, conductivity, and all these cells that get stimulated will contractility. So excitability, automaticity, conductivity, and contractility. Which is very different than nerve cells, skeletal muscle cells. They do not have automaticity. So these are the peculiar properties of cardiac cells. Okay, we'll not be going into any details of action potential. I just want to say few things. So the resting membrane potential, or at rest, the resting membrane potential of the cell membrane of a cardiac cell is negative. And then when a stimulus causes excitation of that cell, it will cause the action potential to be less negative, so depolarized. The stimulus just needs to get the resting membrane potential up to here. And then the cell membrane will just open channels to continue the depolarization. Okay, so this is the threshold. The stimulus just needs to be strong enough to get the resting membrane potential up to the threshold, and then the action potential will just continue. Depolarization, then plateau, and at that phase, lots of calcium is poured into the cytoplasm of the cell, and then this causes contraction, and then repolarization to get it back to the resting membrane potential again. If a stimulus comes at that stage, the cell will not respond. So we call that refractory period. Okay? If a stimulus was too weak to stimulate the cell up to the threshold, it will not generate the action potential and go back. So the stimulus needs to be strong enough to move the resting membrane potential into the threshold. Then you get the action potential plateau, calcium contraction. During that phase, the cell is not responsive, refractory period, and then repolarization and keeps going on. There are specialized cardiac cells to handle the generation and conductivity of the electricity. Okay, all cardiac cells are able to generate action potential, and all of them are able to conduct them. But there are specialized cells that would do that a lot more efficient, so a much higher rate and a lot quicker speed of conductivity. So essentially in the SA node, AV node, and bundle of His Purkinje fibers. So this is the action potential of like the SA node. And then you can see that the resting membrane potential is not flat. It's not waiting for a stimulus to come. It just depolarizes itself till it reaches the threshold and then generates the action potential. But then it doesn't need a plateau here. It doesn't need to contract as such. It has been specialized to work as a like an electric thing. So this is the conduction tissue. And these different groups of cells differ in the rate that they generate. So the quickest rate is the SA node, followed by the AV node, then the Purkinje fibers. Okay? Okay. So now, since all cardiac cells are able to generate action potential, and then whatever cell gets that action potential will transmit it to the neighboring one, and then the other one is excitable, so will get action potential and keep conducting. So you just need the action potential to be excited at only one place, and then this will be conducted to the whole heart. Okay? And so, since they all have automaticity, which cell will just take over? The faster. Okay? So, and the SA node is the fastest in normal, and so that's why the SA node is the normal pacemaker for the heart. What about the other cells that have different rates? They will all be excited, and then they will start generating their automaticity from the start, but then they get stimulus from the SA node, and then so they get the action potential, and then try to get another action potential, and then get excited again. So whatever is faster in the heart will just be the pacemaker and take over. Okay? So this is the basic view of the conduction system. So SA node is a group of specialized cardiac muscle cells at the junction between the SA node and the SVC and the right atrium. Then the excitation wave will eventually reach the AV node, which lies at the base, the floor of the right atrium. But then the electric excitation needs to go to the ventricle, and then it faces a fibrofatty insulation. So there's a fibrofatty insulation. So electricity cannot pass from atrium to ventricle except through a single channel, which is the bundle of His. So the bundle of His crosses that fibrofatty insulation. And then the bundle of His will branch into a right bundle branch, left bundle branch. And now we have some characteristics here. So the SA node is, in the normal condition, is the fastest. Then the excitation wave will reach the AV node. The only pathway for the excitation wave to reach the bundle of His is through the AV node. And the AV node has an important characteristic, is that the excitation wave gets a significant delay at the AV node. So the excitation wave is still there, but it is very slow across the AV node till it reaches the bundle of His. And once it reaches the bundle of His, the excitation wave goes very, very quickly. So this is by far the fastest conductivity in the heart across both right and left bundle branches together. Why do we have this configuration? So for example, why do we have an AV delay? What is that useful for?
For lasting time.
Okay, so let's assume that the excitation wave was able to go quick enough from the atrium to the ventricle, and then while the atrium is contracting, the ventricle has started to contract. Okay, and then now, so how much is the pressure in the left atrium, for example, as compared to the left ventricle? Would the left atrium or the left ventricle generate more pressure? Left ventricle. And then we have a valve in between. And so when the atrium wants to contract, it will find the ventricle contracted with a lot higher pressure and a closed valve. And then this atrial contraction will not be useful. So to be able to get benefit from the atrial contraction, which is actually quite important to increase the filling of the ventricle, which increase the cardiac output, you want the atrium to finish contraction before the ventricle starts. And that's why the AV delay. Okay, so why do we need specialized conduction tissue with very, very high speed of conduction to get into right and left ventricles together? So there's an important concept here about the interventricular dependence. The efficiency of contraction of the right ventricle is a whole lot better if it contracts while the left ventricle is also contracting. It's as if you're holding your back towards the wall while pushing something. So this is the septum, and you want the right ventricle to contract against a solid septum rather than a relaxed one. Okay? And why do we need the very quick conduction across the septum to the free wall of the left ventricle? Essentially, the speed of conduction is really, really fast, so that practically the septum contracts with almost the free wall almost at the same time. So let's assume that this is the septum, and this is the free wall of the left ventricle. Which way is more energy efficient for the contraction? If the septum contracts first, then the free wall, or they both contract together? Okay, now we've had the same force of contraction, same amount of energy expenditure, but you get a lot more ejection from the heart because they contract together, rather than having the septum contracting first, then the free wall. So it is very important for the excitation wave to reach the right and the left ventricle at the same time, but also for the left ventricle to be excited, the septum and the free wall at the same time. Okay? So now we have talked about synchrony between the atrium and the ventricle with an EV delay, and we know that this does increase cardiac output, improves the ventricular filling and increase cardiac output. So AV synchrony, interventricular synchrony, and intraventricular synchrony. Okay? And that's why this configuration is very efficient to reach these goals. So AV node is the only entry from atria to ventricles. Otherwise, there is a fibrofatty insulation. It is one way. So electrical stimulation of the ventricle in normal situation cannot reach the atrium. So, but electrical stimulation of the atrium is able to reach the ventricle through the AV node and bundle of His. So AV node is the only entry. It is one way from atrium to ventricle and has a period of delay. On the other hand, bundle of His and bundle branches are specialized cells with very, very fast speed of conductivity. And the only way for the excitation wave to reach the bundle of His is through the AV node. So direct stimulation of the free wall of the ventricle cannot cause stimulation of the bundle of His. Okay? But so do you mean if we get an electrical stimulation of the free wall of the right ventricle, would that stimulation propagate? Yes, it will, because this ventricle has all cells are excitable and have conductivity, so it will eventually reach the septum, then the free wall of the left ventricle, but at a much slower rate than this excitation wave coming through the AV node bundle of His. Okay? How on ECG, how would you say that the excitation wave took long or took short period? The width of the QRS. So if the QRS is narrow, this means that the excitation wave was very quick. If it is wide, then it took longer time to happen. So if the QRS complex is caused by excitation wave coming from the AV node through bundle of His, the QRS should be narrow. While if you stimulate the free wall of the ventricle and then eventually this reaches the septum, then the free wall of the left ventricle, it will take longer, and so the QRS will be wider. Okay? And exciting the free wall of the right ventricle cannot cause stimulation of the bundle of His and then continue as fast. It will continue as the slow conductivity across the cells. So an important concept here is we know that cardiac output is heart rate multiplied by stroke volume. So the heart rate is an essential component in the cardiac output. In adults, if the heart rate drops slightly, the filling of the ventricle will be more, and then the stretch of the muscle cells will be more, and then the contractility increases by the Starling law, which then would compensate for drop in heart rate. So if an adult who has a heart rate of 90 and then his heart rate drops to like 75, the stroke volume will increase and then the cardiac output will not be much affected. Well, this actually is not true in small babies. In pediatrics and small babies, especially in neonates, the compliance of the ventricle is very little. And so the drop in the heart rate will not be compensated by equivalent increase in stroke volume. And so dropping heart rate in small babies means dropping cardiac output. So heart rate is very essential, especially in small babies. We've discussed AV synchrony, interventricular and intraventricular synchrony. Oh, are you good? Are you good? Okay. So we start talking about pacemakers. So now we need to use these principles to essentially get adequate heart rate with as much as possible physiological scenario. So AV, trying to maintain AV synchrony, interventricular and intraventricular synchrony. Okay, so there are different types of pacemaker and different boxes. Again, we're only talking about temporary pacing in this talk. So it can pace a single chamber, so either ventricle or atria, and we can pace both atria and ventricles. So these are different boxes. But then let's talk about mode. So how are these pacemakers programmed to actually work? Okay, this is essentially mode. So we describe mode by 3 basic letters. So something like AAI, VVI, and DDD, and things like that. Okay. So what do these letters mean? So the first letter is the chamber that is being paced. Okay. So what are we pacing? Second letter is what are we sensing? And then the third letter is, what is the response of sensing on pacing? Okay? This is a pacemaker, generates electricity, and this electricity will reach the heart. What chamber are we actually providing electricity for? Providing stimulus, pacing. Okay? And then in some modes, we'll actually keep sensing any electricity that is actually being transmitted in that chamber. And then based on the mode, we'll do what response on the pacing that was supposed to be delivered. So let's assume that we want to pace the ventricle. Then we sense the ventricle first for any QRS. If there is a QRS, the pacemaker will inhibit the ventricular pacing that was supposed to be delivered. Okay? So then pacing will be V, ventricle, sensing V, response is I, inhibitory. Again, response is effect of sensing on pacing, not effect of sensing on the heart. So inhibitory does not mean that we can inhibit the heart. We inhibit the pacing, okay? So there's no way if the heart has a rate of 80 that we put a pacemaker at a rate of 60 and then we get to a heart slower. You cannot do that. Why can't we do that?
Because the heart take upper hand.
Because the faster will take the upper hand.
Yeah.
And since the heart is faster, the rest of the cells will be excited, okay? What are the options for chambers to be paced? Atrium, ventricle, dual. What are the options for chambers to be sensed? Atrium, ventricle, dual, or none. So we do not sense, 0. So we just code that as O. And what are the options for a response? Either can be inhibitory, dual, or none. If I do not sense, I wouldn't react. Okay? What is dual? We just said inhibitory. We'll get to that later, okay? So now we want to go across the most commonly used modes in the context of temporary pacing in the perioperative period. We go through each with a set of examples so that we know what are the advantages, disadvantages, and when to use each. I. What are we pacing? Atrium. What are we sensing? Atrium. What is the response of sensing atrial activity on atrial pacing? Inhibitory. So sensing atrial activity will inhibit atrial pacing. So we get an example. A patient is in sinus rhythm with a rate of 60 per minute. He does not have heart block. And we connect him to a pacemaker on mode AI at a rate of 90 per minute. Now, you tell me what is atrial rate and where it comes from. What is the ventricular rate, where it comes from, and what is the pacemaker doing now? So atrial rate is 90. Where does it come from? Pacing. Okay, that's great. So that's 90 paced, because the pacemaker is faster than the sinus rhythm. What's the ventricular rate? 90. And where does it come from? So it is conducted. That's nice. Okay, so 90 conducted because he does not have heart block. And what is the pacemaker doing now? It is pacing atrium. So that is pacing atrium. Okay. So what's the benefit of this setting? What did we get from here? We were able to increase heart rate, which can be very beneficial. So now we actually got benefit from such a mode in this patient. Okay. Let's assume another patient has a sinus rhythm of rate 90 per minute. He does not have heart block, and we connect a pacemaker with a mode of AAI at a rate of 60. What's the atrial rate? 90 comes from? That's the sinus. What's the ventricular rate? 90. Where does it come from? Conducted. And now what's the pacemaker doing? It is being inhibited, okay? Because that's what you tell it to do. Okay, so the pacemaker was programmed to pace at 60 per minute. So it will wait for a second. During that second, if it senses atrial activity, it will inhibit this next atrial pacing, and then starts counting for another second. And then it gets another new sensing of atrial activity. And then it inhibits the next atrial pacing and then starts from here counting for another second. And so it will always continue getting inhibited because the sinus excitation wave always comes before the sinus, the atrial, the pacemaker rate. So what benefit are we getting here? So the pacemaker is not doing anything, huh? It is a backup rate. So now we guarantee that the atrial rate will not be less than 60. So it's good that the sinus rate is adequate for this patient. We do not want to change it, but I just want to make sure that his atrial rate does not drop below 60, and if it does, the pacemaker will automatically start pacing, okay? Which is quite a safety guarantee. Okay, that's good. Now patient has sinus rhythm at rate of 60, but then he has complete heart block with an escape rate of 30 per minute. What's escape rhythm? So you've just said that all cardiac cells have automaticity. So if there is heart block at the level of the AV node, then some cell, either at the lower portion of the AV node or in the ventricle, will start pacing because it has an automatic rate that is 30 per minute. Okay, so that's escape rate. And now we connect this patient with a pacemaker with a mode of AAI at a rate of 90. So what's the atrial rate? 90, which is? Paced. Okay. What's the ventricular rate?
30.
He has heart block. So whatever is happening in the atrium is not being able to be conducted to the ventricle because in addition to the AV node bundle of His, there is fibrofatty insulation. So whatever is happening in the atrium is not able to be conducted into the ventricle. So what's the ventricular rate? This escape rate, the 30. What is the pacemaker doing here? It is pacing. It is actually pacing as it was told to do. It was instructed to pace atrium. This patient might very well die if this escape rhythm is not adequate to provide cardiac output. So AAI pacing is not protective in patient with complete heart block. The patient might still die while the pacemaker is working adequately. So this mode is not protective, may actually be dangerous if the escape rhythm just drops and we think that we're pacing. So this is not useful, might be dangerous. These patients, we're not able to protect them from dying because of heart block while atrially pacing, okay? Okay, another patient has slow AF. So AF with a rate of slightly less than 60. He does not have heart block and connected with to a pacemaker with a mode of AAI at a rate of 90. What would be his atrial rate?
It's able to be a patient with AAI when
I'm asking. What is this heart rate?
Ventricular rate.
Ventricular response to AF. What is the actual rate of the AF?
Very high.
Very, very high, 300, 400, things like that. So this rate is, the heart rate is the ventricular rate. And this is the ventricular response, while the rate of the atrium is a lot higher, a lot higher. So the atrial rate is a lot higher than the 90, the pacemaker. So the atrial rate is AF. What is the ventricular rate?
90. 60.
60.
What is ventricular response?
Respond to
What is the
beat.
ventricular response of the AF? These are the number of times the excitation wave was able to cross the AV junction. Okay? So whatever is happening in the atrium, regardless pacing at 90, or actually the atrial rate is 300, the only number of excitation waves that are able to cross the AV junction are 60. And so this is the slow ventricular response, which is this one, not the pacemaker. The pacemaker is being inhibited all the time. You cannot accelerate rate of patient in AF with atrial pacing, because always the atrial rate will be faster than the pacemaker. Okay? So what is the benefit of atrially pacing a patient in AF? Not useful at all. Okay? Because the atrial rate is a lot higher than anything you will put. Okay? Because he's in AF. The slow ventricular response has nothing to do with the atrial rate. This is how many conduction waves are able to cross the AV junction. Okay? So in conclusion, AI mode is useful to increase heart rate. Would it increase the heart rate in a physiological or a non-physiological manner? So do you think there is an AV synchrony?
Yes.
Yes, because pacing atrial the excitation wave will eventually have to go to the ventricle through the AV node, and then you get the AV delay, and then it will cross across the bundle of His with the bundle branches with very quick excitation of both ventricles together, the left ventricle septum with the free wall. So you get the AV synchrony, the interventricular synchrony, and intraventricular synchrony. Okay, so it is useful to increase the heart rate in a very physiological manner. It can be used to guarantee a minimum atrial rate, which is a backup fashion, but it is not useful in heart block. Patient might still die if has heart block, although we are atrially pacing, and absolutely not useful in patients with very quick atrial arrhythmia like atrial fibrillation. It can be used in SVT to overdrive pacing. This is different. When I say atrial arrhythmia, I'm essentially talking about atrial fibrillation. On the other hand, if patients with SVT, supraventricular tachycardia, you can overdrive pacing with atrial pacing and then go back. Okay. So we move to the next mode, AOO. What are we pacing? Atrium. What are we sensing?
Nothing.
None. What is the response of not sensing? Nothing. So now the pacemaker is connected to the atrium, has his eyes shut, and then he keeps pacing. And he knows nothing about what is happening in the atrium. Okay? This is essentially what we're doing here. So we move quicker, but sinus 60, no heart block, pacemaker 90, AOO. What's the atrial rate? 90. What's the ventricular rate?
90.
Which is
Pacing.
conducted. And what's the pacemaker doing?
Pacing.
Pacing, because the sinus rhythm is slower than the pacemaker. So we're now pacing. And this is essentially the same as AI in this case. You put the pacemaker quicker than the atrial rate, and then it gets the atrial rate faster. What if the patient has sinus rhythm at 90 with no heart block and pacemaker AOO at a rate of 60? So AOO pacing for the atrium at a lower rate than the atrial rate. What's the atrial rate? 90, which is? What about the pacemaker? So it keeps pacing. The 90 of the sinus rhythm are coming, but then it gets. So sometimes the pacemaker will pace, and then it comes on a refractory period, and then nothing happens. And then it comes at a period which was not refractory period, and then it gets paced. And then a refractory period, and then not, and then not, and then refractory period, and then not, and so you get irregular rhythm. We call that interference. So sometimes sinus, sometimes pacing, because the pacemaker does not sense the atrium. It doesn't have to do anything with its own rhythm, and it'll keep pacing at a fixed rate. What's the ventricular rate? Same. Whatever happens in the atrium will just be conducted to the ventricle because there's no heart block. What's the pacemaker doing? Pacing. Has his eyes shut and pacing. So what do you conclude from here? You got interference. Atrial interference. Okay, not very dangerous, but essentially not useful. If anything, might be harmful, might actually disturb cardiac output and synchrony. Sinus 60, heart block, escape 30, AOO 90. What's the atrial rate?
Spacing. Irregular.
So the pacemaker is faster than the sinus rhythm. So what's the atrial rate? 90, which is paced. What's the ventricular rate? Escape still, because whatever you do in the atrium is not conducted to the ventricle. There's complete heart block. And the pacemaker is still pacing, so it is, again, not protective for patients with heart block. This patient may still die with the atrial pacing gone. AF, no heart block, pacemaker 90, AOO. What's the atrial rate? AF. So it is the very fast rate of the AF. Whatever the ventricular response, either slow or rapid. What's the pacemaker doing here? It's still pacing. Most of the time, this pacing will actually do absolutely nothing because the atrial rate is a lot faster, but then sometimes but across that case, nothing matters because you cannot get it more case. So again, not useful. So essentially, we're not getting a lot of benefit from AOO mode as compared to the AI. Why would you have such a mode, which is actually not very useful? Huh? So it can increase heart rate. It can cause interference, and not useful in heart block and atrial arrhythmia, which is, so can increase heart rate in a physiological manner like AI, but otherwise it's either equivalent or worse. Why would you have this? Let you know. Let's talk about that later. Okay, now we go to the ventricle. So now we've discussed atrial pacing, AAI, atrial pacing, atrial sensing inhibits atrial pacing, AI. AOO, which is fixed atrial pacing without sensing. Now we move to the ventricle, VVI. What are we pacing? Ventricle. What are we sensing? Ventricle. What's the response of ventricular sensing on the ventricular pacing? So sensing ventricular activity inhibits ventricular pacing. Sinus 60, no heart block, VVI 90. What's the atrial rate?
60.
We're pacing at 90.
We're pacing no electrogradation.
One way.
No electrogradation.
So ventricular pacing cannot, in the normal situation, cannot be conducted to the atrium. So atrial rate is 60, which is sinus. The ventricular rate, 90, which is paced. What's the pacemaker doing?
Pacing.
Pacing. So what did we get here?
Increase cardiac.
We are able to increase the heart rate. Do you think that happens in a physiological or a non-physiological manner? In a non-physiological, why? What is there AV synchrony? No, you get AV dissociation. The atrial rate is 60, ventricular rate is 90. You lose significant part of the cardiac output because you lose the regular cardiac filling. What about the interventricular synchrony? Affected, so lost. Intraventricular lost. Essentially, patients on long-term VVI pacing, I mean permanent pacing, on VVI, eventually end up with pacemaker-induced cardiomyopathy because of that long-term inefficient ventricular contraction. Interventricular and intraventricular. Okay, so this is not an ideal situation, but you're still able to increase the heart rate, at least during the temporary period. You can increase the heart rate, but you get AV dissociation. Okay, VVI, patient's sinus 90, no heart block. VVI at a rate of 60. What's the atrial rate? 90, which is sinus. What's the ventricular rate? 90 conducted. What's the pacemaker doing? Again, the same like the AAI. It gets inhibited. It waits for a second, and then each time you get excitation before that second ends. And then sensing ventricular activity inhibits ventricular pacing that was supposed to come, and then starts counting a new second and keeps going on. It is always getting inhibited because it is always being preceded by the conducted wave from the atrium. Okay? So the pacemaker is not doing anything here. What do we get from this situation? Again, that's a backup mode. So you guarantee a backup rate. So the patient rate is good enough. We're happy with that. We do not want to change it. We just want to guarantee that his heart rate, his ventricular rate, will not drop below 60. Okay? And that's a good thing if patients keeps going into heart blocks or sinus bradycardia or whatever. Okay? Sinus 90, heart block with escape rate of 30 per minute. VVI 60. So what is the atrial rate? 90, which is sinus. What's the ventricular rate? 60, which is paced. Okay, because that's the ventricular pacing at 60. What's the pacemaker doing here? We're pacing. So what do we get from here? You could actually save his life. This patient, when was put on atrial pacing, he could very well die because of heart block if the escape rhythm is not adequate. So this is definitely protective. You are able to protect patients who have heart block. So that's great. This was not available to atrial pacing. AF slow response 60, no heart block, VVI 90. What's the atrial rate? The AF. So you're not falling down. You're not getting that trap. Okay. So the atrial rate is very high, the AF rate. What's the ventricular rate? 90, which is paced. It essentially wanted to get the rate of 60. Most of the time, this will get it faster. Because obviously the AF is not regular, so sometimes can get one excitation wave that can get slightly quicker. But most of the time, you're pacing. and the pacemaker is pacing ventricle. Again, when this patient was atrially paced, you were not able to get his heart rate faster because the atrial rate is very high. So you cannot accelerate the rate of AF by atrial pacing. So we are able to increase heart rate in patients with heart block and with AF using ventricular pacing. So rapid AF 120, no heart block, VVI 90. What's the atrial rate? AF. What's the ventricular rate?
120.
The rapid AF. So you're not able to get the AF slower by ventricular pacing at a lower rate because the faster will just take over. And the pacemaker will most of the time be inhibited. And so now, what's the benefit here?
Backup.
That's like a backup. So in conclusion, VVI can be used to increase the heart rate. It is safe. It is not physiological. You get AV dissociation. Intra and interventricular synchrony are lost. But it is useful to guarantee a minimum heart rate as a backup. And it can be used in heart block and atrial arrhythmia. When I say atrial arrhythmia, most of the time I mean AF. Okay? So, and in these situations, we're not getting benefit from atrial pacing. So ventricular pacing is definitely valuable. It just have the problem of not being physiological. Okay, like the AOO, we have another non-useful mode, VOO. So what are we pacing? Ventricle. What are we sensing? None. What is the response of not sensing? Nothing. Again, pacemaker connect to the ventricle, his eyes shut, and keeps pacing at a fixed rate. Sinus 60, no heart block. VOO 90. What's the atrial rate? 60, which is sinus. What's the ventricular rate? 90, which is pacing, because you're pacing faster than his own rhythm. What's the pacemaker doing? Pacing ventricular. Okay, so what did we achieve here? Increase the heart rate. Again, this is very similar to the VVI. You get the non-physiological increase in the heart rate with the AV dissociation. Sinus 90. No heart block. VOO at a rate of 60. What's the atrial rate?
90 sinus.
90 sinus. What's the ventricular rate?
90 conducted.
Pacing and the sign الاثنين.
No, it's faster than
faster. بس الثاني لما
You're not sensing. You have your eyes shut. You keep pacing ventricle. So sometimes it comes on a refractory period and does nothing. Sometimes it gets on a not a refractory period and then again paced. Then sometimes you pace on the T and then you get R on T. You get VF. You have caused your patient to die. When the patient had heart block and we paced atrial, we were not able to save him, but he was dying himself. Now we're actually killed him. You should absolutely not pace VO. This is a dangerous mode that causes your patient to die. You're very likely to get R on T if the own rate of the patient is faster than the pacemaker. You get the phenomenon of R on T, and then, which ends up in the VF. You should absolutely not do this. We're not containing any scenarios in this mode. This mode should absolutely not be used. Why would you put a mode that actually kills patients? And what's the problem in VVI? It doesn't kill patients. Why would you use VO? So let's assume a patient has mitral valve disease. And then he had mitral valve replacement. And then during his mitral valve replacement, he got heart block and had a pacemaker put. Okay? And his pacemaker was adjusted to be VVI. And then essentially he required another operation. Whatever, but aortic valve disease, stuck mitral, whatever. He now needs another operation. Okay? So now we need to reopen the chest. Reopening the chest requires using electrocautery, diathermy. Electrocautery works by electricity, obviously. Okay. What is sensing? We just keeps ventricular sensing. What is actually the pacemaker doing while sensing? It just senses electricity that is higher than the number adjusted. Okay? And trust me, the diathermy gets a lot higher than that. And then the pacemaker will assume that this is actually a ventricular activity. So it will inhibit ventricular pacing. This specific patient does not have an escape rhythm. So whenever you use the diathermy, pacing stops, heart stops. So you cannot allow that. So you just tell the pacemaker, okay, just trust me, just beat at a fixed rate. You ensure that this rate is higher than the patient's own rate. And then you keep like that just during the period of the operation. And once you finish, you put it back into the VVI mode. So when would you put a patient on VOO? You absolutely should not. Okay? Unless in the very, very limited situation where you want to pace a patient who has heart block, dependent on the pacemaker, and you really, really need to use electrocautery. Then during this very brief period, you just pace VO and then revert it back after you finish. Okay? Let me tell you. You are actually putting patients on VOO every day. What is sensing? You tell the pacemaker, consider anything higher than the number of the sensitivity that I've just adjusted, anything higher than that, so just assume that this is activity. And then if you put that number to the maximum, you just tell the pacemaker to ignore anything. You've put VVI mode. But then if you turn the sensitivity to the maximum, you actually transform the VVI mode into a VOO mode, which is dangerous and causes patients to die. You should absolutely not put sensitivity on the maximum, because this put it on a really, really dangerous mode. Okay? How you adjust sensitivity is actually quite difficult. We'll discuss that, okay? But the answer is not just putting it on the maximum. Okay? Are you still living? Are you still here? Okay. What's coming is more difficult. Okay. So we've been talking about atrial pacing, AAI, AOO. What's the use of AOO? Same as VOO, okay? So AAI, AOO, VVI, VOO, which are single chamber pacing, atrial or ventricular. Now we notice that actually atrial pacing is very, very beneficial. It's actually useful to increase the heart rate. It is very physiological. It's actually not safe and protective if the patient has heart block or significant atrial arrhythmia. On the other hand, the ventricular pacing is safe, is protective, but very unphysiological. Can you combine both? So let's combine both. Now we pace D. What's D? Dual atrium ventricle. We sense D, dual atrium ventricle. What's the response of dual sensing on dual pacing? Inhibitory. So atrial sensing inhibits atrial pacing. Ventricular sensing inhibits ventricular pacing. What I'm going to say is not accurate, okay? This is not accurate, but it gets it a lot easier to understand. This is as if you're putting your patient on an AAI and a separate VVI pacemakers. As if you're connecting the atrium to an AAI pacemaker and the ventricle to a VVI pacemaker. This is not accurate, but just get it easier to understand. Sinus 60, no heart block, DDI 90. What's the sinus? What's the atrial rate?
90.
Which is paced, because we're pacing dual. What's the ventricular rate? 90, which is paced again, because. But there's no heart block. I mean, you have just paced atrial, and then why don't that gets conducted to the ventricle? You can. There's no heart block. So the ventricular rate is 90. Is that conducted?
Yeah.
But you're also pacing at 90.
Pacing.
So are we pacing or conducted?
Simply causing the delay.
Ha! Exactly. Okay, so it depends. Remember when I told you that you're connected to an atrial pacemaker and another ventricular pacemaker? That's not correct, because they're connected by the AV delay. So you tell the pacemaker, okay, now pace atrial, and then wait for this period of time, and then pace ventricle. You want to simulate the AV delay, okay? What's the normal time that the atrial activity gets into the ventricular activity? So what do we call this period? The PR interval, okay? And so something like less than 200 milliseconds, okay? And so if the pacemaker that has a setting of AV delay has this delay shorter than PR interval, it will just assume that the patient is in heart block, because it kept waiting till this period, no ventricular activity, we just pace. On the other hand, if the PR interval is shorter than the AV delay, the ventricular pacemaker will sense ventricular activity before it paces, and then it will just get inhibited. Okay? So, ventricular rate is indeed 90, but it can be either conducted or paced depending on the relation between the PR interval of the patient and the AV delay, the setting at the pacemaker. Okay? How do we know that now we're either pacing or conducted?
Spike QRS.
The lamp. The lamp in the pacemaker. It keeps. So pacemaker boxes here gets lamps, either pacing or sensing. Okay, so you actually look at the pacemaker and you know is it pacing or pacing, okay? But also, yes.
I want to look at ECG.
From ECG, you can know if there is a spike and if the QRS is wide. Then, so if there is a spike followed by a wide QRS, this is a paced complex. On the other hand, if there's no spike and narrow QRS, then it is conducted. Does it make any difference? Does it actually make any difference? It's still 90. Okay, you still get the AV association, AV synchrony, but the interventricular and intraventricular synchrony are lost. On the other hand, the battery will get discharged faster. This is actually important in the permanent pacing, because if the battery gets consumed, you actually do more frequent operations. Okay. So what we were able to achieve here?
Increase heart rate.
We were able to increase the heart rate, but we went into the situation where actually we paced ventricular unnecessarily. If we're not, because this patient does not have heart block, yet we still sometimes paced. So, and this is actually not physiological. So, you can increase the heart rate, but you run the risk of unnecessary ventricular pacing. It's still not dangerous. If it senses ventricular activity, it will inhibit itself. This should not get the patient in a VF or anything, but it is just not ideal. What if the patient has a sinus rhythm at a rate of 90, no heart block, pacemaker DDI at a rate of 60? So what's the atrial rate? 90, which is sinus. Ventricular rate,
90.
which is
Conducted.
or paced. Same. AV delay, PR interval, same. Okay. So there are no interference here, but then you're able to run into that. I'm sorry. That's DDI 60. Okay. This will not pace. Absolutely not pace. So this is conducted. I'm sorry. So the 90 is sinus, and the ventricular rate 90, which is conducted. And what's the pacemaker doing? Inhibited. Inhibited atrial and ventricular, because atrial rate is quicker, ventricular rate conducted is quicker. So you still. So what's the benefit here?
Backup.
That's backup on atrial and ventricular level. So you're able to put the patient on a backup rate, and if he goes to heart block, you're still safe. And then you can still pace them in a physiological manner. So you get backup rate on the atrial and ventricular. If you put this patient on AI and he gets transient heart block, this might not be protective. Sinus 90, heart block, escape of 30, pacemaker DDI 60. What's the atrial rate?
90.
Which is
Sinus.
sinus. What's the ventricular rate?
60.
60, which is
Paced.
paced. And
Basic.
what's the pacemaker doing?
Basic ventricle. Basic inhibited.
So the atrial pacing is inhibited, while ventricular pacing is actually working. So inhibited on the atria and pacing on the ventricle. What did we achieve here?
Protected.
We are able to protect that patient from the heart block, yet we've reached AV dissociation. Again, the most important thing here is that the patient doesn't die, but you lose the AV synchrony, so you get AV dissociation. Again, very similar to the VVI here. Slow AF 60, no heart block, DDI 90. What's the atrial rate? AF? No, not 60. The atrial rate is very high. What's the ventricular rate? At least that 90. Now we're able to increase the rate, the slow response, because now we're ventricularly pacing. What's the pacemaker doing?
Inhibited atrial pacing will be paced ventricular.
Yes. So inhibited on the atrial level and pacing on the ventricular level. So what did we achieve here?
We increase heart
We are able to increase heart rate in F. Did we actually get any benefit from any sensing or any pacing for a patient with chronic AF? I mean, in any scenario that we have gone through, was it beneficial to sense or pace atrium in a patient with heart block with a rate of 300?
No.
So it will always be inhibited, and even if we pace on that, it will not increase the ventricular rate. Okay, so patients with chronic AF do not get atrial wires in operations. Okay, Obviously, if the patient goes into a brief episode of AF and you want to revert him back, this is something. Or on the other hand, if the patient has chronic AF, but then after coming off bypass, he's back to sinus, you actually make use of this and slightly pace atrial till you get better cardiac output during that period. But then, as general rule of thumb, patients with chronic AF have absolutely no benefit putting atrial wires in the first place. Okay? I'm talking about AF. Again, atrial arrhythmia like SVT, you can actually get benefit by overdrive pacing. So in conclusion, this mode is as if we're pacing atrial and ventricular separately, AAI and VVI. It is safe. It can guarantee minimum atrial and ventricular rates. Might cause AV dissociation. And it can be used in hard block and to increase the ventricular rate in AF. Okay? But again, very similar to the VVI pacing. But we've gone into the scenario of causing unnecessary ventricular pacing. So can we even get a more smart mode? Here comes the DDD. We're pacing dual atrium and ventricle. We're sensing dual atrium and ventricle. What's the response of dual sensing on dual pacing?
Pacing or
Dual.
inhibit.
Dual, either inhibitory or trigger. So what's inhibitory doing? Atrial sensing inhibits atrial pacing. Ventricular sensing inhibits ventricular pacing. What's the trigger thing? Atrial sensing triggers ventricular pacing. This is a mode that guarantees that every ventricular activity, every atrial activity is followed by ventricular activity, either from the patient or from the pacemaker. This is a mode that guarantees AV association. Again, so the DDD mode is a mode that guarantees that every atrial activity is followed by ventricular activity, either coming from the patient or from the pacemaker. This is a mode that guarantees AV association. Sinus 60, no hard block, DDD 90. What's the sinus rate? What's the atrial rate? Which is pacing. Okay, we're quicker than the atrial rate, the sinus rate. So 90 paced. What's the ventricular rate? 90, which is conducted or pacing? AV delay, PR interval, they're exactly the same. Okay, same. Okay, so I'm sorry, you have to adjust the AV delay. Okay. Okay. What's the pacemaker doing? It's pacing atrial plus or minus ventricle. Okay. What did we achieve here? We have increased heart rate, but with unnecessary ventricular pacing. We've always been following the AV association. Okay? But you can pace ventricular unnecessarily. Sinus 60. Hard block, escape 30. DDD 90. What is the atrial rate? 90, which is paced. What is the ventricular rate? 90, which is again paced, hard block. What is the pacemaker doing? Pacing atrium and ventricle. So in this patient, if you have paced atrial, you have caused the patient to die because you're not pacing the ventricle. If you have paced VVI, it is safe, but then you lose the AV synchrony. So you still have the AV synchronization, okay? But on the other hand, that's exactly what you have got in the DDI. So, if that had that had DDI pacing, so atrial pacing will be faster than the sinus. Ventricular pacing will be faster than heart block. So you still pace 90 atrium, 90 ventricle. So this mode in that scenario is very, very similar to the DDI. Okay, let's assume a patient has a rate of 90 sinus, heart block with escape rhythm of 30, D, rate of 60. What's the atrial rate? 90, which is sinus. What is the ventricular rate?
60.
Atrial sensing triggers ventricular pacing. 90, but you've put the pacemaker on 60. How would pace 90?
There is a heart block.
Atrial sensing triggers ventricular pacing. This mode guarantees AV association. Atrial sensing triggers ventricular pacing. What you're describing is the DDI. If you put this patient on DDI, you get an atrial rate of 90 and ventricular rate of 60. But since this is DDD, where atrial sensing triggers ventricular pacing, the pacemaker is able to pace at a rate higher than the adjusted rate. Consider that as the minimum rate. Okay? It guarantees that every atrial activity is followed by ventricular activity from the patient or the pacemaker. Guarantees AV association. This gets very confusing. You put patients on a pacemaker at 60 and then you find the heart rate is 90. So you think the heart block is gone, and now you stop the pacemaker and the patient is baseline. It is pacing faster than you adjusted because you told it to do so. You actually put it on a dual response mode. So although the atrial rate is 60, it is the pacemaker was adjusted on 60, it is still able to pace at a higher rate. And then you still have the AV synchronization. You're not able to get this in any other mode. Okay? If you put this patient on DDI, you'll get AV dissociation. Sinus 90, no heart block. DDD 60.
Atrial 90.
Sinus 90. Oh, so the atrial rate is
90 sinus.
90 sinus. Ventricular rate is
90
90
pacing.
conducted.
90 conducted. 90 conducted.
or paced.
Conducted or paced.
Atrial sensing triggers ventricular pacing.
اوكي الاتريال هاير ذان الباك الهارت ريت اللي انا حاطه على البيس ميكر.
Atrial sensing triggers ventricular pacing. So once it senses atrial activity, the ventricular pacing will be triggered after the AV delay. Again, it will wait for the AV delay. And then if it gets ventricular activity, it will be inhibited. If it does not, if it is few milliseconds later, it will assume that the patient is in heart block and stop pacing to guarantee the AV association. What did we actually mean by putting a patient on DDD at a lower rate than his own rate with no heart block? We actually meant to put him in a backup. So, well, actually, you start pacing ventricular unnecessarily. DDD is not a good backup mode because you can start losing physiology for no good reason. Patient has good heart rate and no heart block. You should not keep pacing him unnecessarily because the PR interval is just slightly longer than the AV delay sought in the pacemaker. Okay? If you want to put a patient on a backup mode, put it on DDI or VVI, not DDD. DDD can cause unnecessarily ventricular pacing. Okay? AF. No heart block. D 90. What's the atrial rate? F. What's the ventricular rate? Guarantees that every atrial activity followed by ventricular.
guarantee 300.
Okay, it is smart enough not to cause VF, okay? But then it will pace the ventricle really quick and really irregular. Okay, there's a maximum tracking rate. So you can put a limit to the maximum rate that this atrial sensing that triggers ventricular pacing. So there's a maximum for that. But this is so absolutely nonsense. You should absolutely not put the patient with AF on DDD because it's quite dangerous. Patients with AF should not have any atrial wires because it's not useful, might be dangerous. So in conclusion, the DDD mode guarantees every atrial activity followed by ventricular activity with a minimum rate of the pacemaker. So this is not the actual set rate, this is the minimum rate that it guarantees. It is useful in heart block, can be dangerous in atrial arrhythmia. So what do we do in atrial arrhythmia? DDI. It is a lot safer. It will not trigger ventricular pacing by atrial sensing. Might still lead to unnecessary ventricular pacing. So I've discussed AAI, atrial sensing, inhibit ventricular pacing. AOO, very limited use. VVI, ventricular sensing, inhibits ventricular pacing. Safe, protective, yet unphysiological. VOO should absolutely not be used unless very limited scenario, very dangerous, can lead to VF. Do not turn the VVI into VOO by setting the sensitivity to maximum. DDI, quite useful as a backup mode, yet can lead to unnecessary ventricular pacing and can, in some scenarios, lead to AV dissociation. DDD is quite a smart mode, yet can be dangerous in atrial arrhythmia and can lead sometimes to unnecessary ventricular pacing, but it guarantees AV association, AV sync. So what to choose when? If you want to increase the heart rate in a patient with no heart block, AI is the most physiological here. So a patient has no heart block, yet he has escape nodal rhythm. So essentially he has sinus node dysfunction. What would you do here? Still AI, there's no heart block. So nodal rhythm does not mean heart block. Nodal rhythm can be escaped because of dysfunctional SA node. Atrial pacing will still work. Obviously, it would not work, and the AI would not work in the heart block if the escape nodal is because of heart block. But escape nodal in the context of sinus node dysfunction, still AI. Heart block, no atrial arrhythmia. DDD. Heart block with AF or SVT or atrial arrhythmia. VVI, because if you have AF, there's no value of pacing atrial at all, or sensing atrial. On the other hand, if you get just some atrial arrhythmia that are transient, DDI will be more safe. So either VVI or DDI, depending on what atrial arrhythmia. You want to achieve backup pacing, the patient heart rate is good enough, he does not have heart block, yet he might go transiently into heart block or into bradycardia. So either VVI or DDI. Are you still there? Have you got a very broad idea about modes? Okay. Do not use VO, okay? I cannot stress that more. So what is output? When we kept saying now we pace ventricle, what did we actually mean by pace ventricle? we actually the pacemaker will generate an electric current to stimulate the ventricle so that it gets just above the threshold, and then the action potential will just carry on. Okay? So you want to achieve the capturing threshold, and this is measured by volt, so the number of volts that the pacemaker actually generates to stimulate the chamber that is being paced. This is the output. Okay? What is sensitivity? This is a bit tricky. So now we tell the pacemaker that now we have a lead, a pacing lead, that is attached to the chamber that is being sensed. Okay? And you instruct the pacemaker that any electrical activity above that set number, consider that as activity. And then do whatever the response is supposed to do. Okay? So if you're inhibiting the pacing, if you find that activity, just inhibit pacing. Okay? Why don't you just sense anything? And then you'll be very sensitive. Because there are lots of other noise that you want to ignore. Okay, patients are breathing. And this movement and the respiratory muscles actually can, the pacemaker can be misled to think that breathing is the ventricular activity. And then it stops pacing ventricle while the patient is breathing. And there's no ventricular activity, okay? And on the other hand, you've actually set the ventricular output very high. The atrial leads might actually think that this is atrial activity, and then they start. So you want to instruct the pacemaker to ignore the noise, but actually sense the real activities. How would you do that? So let's assume this is voltage, and this is time, and now the pacemaker is sensing. So this is the, let's assume, ventricular activity. Okay? This is what we actually want to sense. Sorry. Now there's a lot of noise. Respiratory muscle movement, other intercostals, diaphragm, okay? So you want to instruct the pacemaker to just ignore all the noise and consider these as the ventricular activity. This is the number of the sensitivity. So if this is like 3 millivolt, just ask the pacemaker to set the sensitivity at 3 millivolt. Whatever activity it senses less than 3 millivolt will just get ignored. If they get activity higher than 3 millivolt, then consider this as actual activity. Okay? What happens if we do this? You ignore ventricular activity, and then you've actually turned the VVI into a VOO. So you consider there is absolutely no ventricular activity, yet there are spikes there, and you keep pacing all around. Okay? And what happens if you do this? You'll actually sense the noise as ventricular activity. So the ventricle gets, the pacing gets inhibited. What if the patient does not have ventricular activity? Inhibited, and the patient does not pace, while actually there is no ventricular activity. And then the patient dies. Okay? So, I'm sorry, adjusting the sensitivity is important, and we have to get that right, okay? Because if you ignore anything, you get VF, and if you sense everything, you actually might not be able to protect patients with no activity. So you want this. So how do we actually adjust these settings? So let's adjust sensitivity. Again, adjusting sensitivity might get confusing, because if I'm working in theater and then I ask the anesthetist, please increase sensitivity, would he consider that increasing the number, or increasing the sensitivity, I mean to be more sensitive and then put the number down. So this can be confusing. What we've been doing is that we say increase the number of sensitivity. So this is very clear. Everybody knows what we're talking about. Okay. How would you adjust this? So now we're doing adjusting the sensitivity for the ventricular pacing. So set the mode on VVI, and then you set the output on minimum and sensitivity on minimum. Okay? So we're now sensing everything and almost not pacing because the output is very, very low. Okay? And then set the rate to be less than the patient's heart rate. So the pacemaker will be sensing this heart rate, the patient's heart rate, but also sensing lots of other noise. And now you start gradually increasing the value of the sensitivity. So that you increase the number, keep increasing the number, till the pacemaker stops sensing the patient's activity and start pacing. So now you're not sensing even his activity, okay? And then you know where it starts pacing at that number. This is the number of sensitivity, and then you put it lower. You put it half of that. So you give yourself a margin, okay? So VVI, minimum output, minimum sensitivity, and then rate less than the patient, and you keep increasing the number of the sensitivity till the pacemaker starts pacing, although the rate is less than the patient. I mean, he stops sensing the patient's activity, and then you know that this is the number, and then you set it on the half of that. Output is easier. You increase the heart rate more than the patient's rate. You increase the output to a very high value, and then it starts pacing because the output is high and the rate is higher. And then you start gradually decreasing till the patient no longer captures the pacing. And then you know that this is the capturing threshold, and then you set it to double of that. So you give yourself a margin. Okay, that's what for the ventricle. You need to do that for the atrium. Okay. So let's have a few tips for troubleshooting. So the pacemaker is set on VVI at a rate of 80, yet the patient heart rate is still 40. So what's the problem here? Sorry? Output is low. Okay. What else? So it is sensing other things. So it thinks that there is activity while they're not, and so it is the number of the sensitivity is too low. Okay. What else? All sorts of mechanical things. The pacemaker lead is not well fixed on the ventricle. The pacing lead is defective. The battery is actually getting consumed. So all sorts of other things. Okay. So this is being paced, and now here is slow rate with no spikes. So again, there are no spikes at all. So it's either oversensing or the mechanical factors. Okay. What about this? These were paced. These are actually spikes that are not followed by QRS. So it's not about a problem of sensing, it is actually pacing. But these pacing spikes are not captured. So you want to increase the output here. The output is very low and it was not captured. Okay. AI 60, yet the heart rate is 40. Again, all the other causes, but added to that heart block. How would you know that there's heart block? If the spike is followed by a P wave, then that means it was actually captured. So it's not the problem of the output sensitivity, the cable or anything. It was actually captured, but this P wave was not conducted. So again, this can be hard luck. Pacemaker VVI 80, yet the heart rate is 100 with irregular interference. So the heart rate is higher than the pacemaker, yet the pacemaker is still pacing. So the problem is the pacemaker is not sensing good enough. So the number of sensitivity is too high. And then it can sometimes get R1T. Luckily, this did not go into VF. So DDD at 60, yet the heart rate is 80 and paced. So the pacemaker keeps pacing at a rate of 80, although you've put it on 60. What's the problem here?
Because at time of atrial.
There's no problem. The atrial rate is 80, so atrial sensing triggers ventricular pacing. DDD is working normally. You're just not aware. Okay? So here, atrial sensing triggers ventricular pacing. Okay? So we've talked about basic principles. We've talked about conduction system, AV delay, AV synchrony, interventricular, intraventricular synchrony. We've talked about pacemaker with different modes, AI, AO, VVI, VOO, DDI, and DDD. Talked about output sensitivity and how to adjust these, and basic troubleshooting. Any questions? Are still there?
Okay.
Yes.
Tell me that inhibit the ventricular pacing.
Yeah.
It goes for any diathermy that patient might need it, not just the open heart.
Yes. Yes. So if you're doing abdominal surgery and the diathermy, well, actually the electric current will go through the body.
So we have to consider the reprogramming.
Yes, reprogramming into an
Might be
async
another
mode.
setting, but just to keep in mind, it's not just the open heart surgery that need this reprogramming, but if the patient is pacemaker dependent.
And doing other surgery that uses electro.
So as a cardiologist, you have to advise or keep in mind that the patient need reprogramming. It might be also a setting to say that many of the pacemakers are now compatible with MRI,
Yes.
but we still need reprogramming for this compatible pacemakers, because what MRI do is just giving an RF pulse, which might be sensed by the pacemaker as activity. So actually all the pacemakers, even the compatible with the MRI, it means that it's possible to go inside the MRI, but we need to do it with reprogramming. So MRI is now currently available in many private centers, but any patient with a pacemaker who go for the MRI need to be checked for two things. First of all, if it's compatible with MRI, not all pacemakers still compatible with MRI, so some of them are not compatible. Second thing, that we need reprogramming, so we need the help of APS team before and after doing the MRI.
Also a quick thing.
Immediately after?
Immediately before and immediately after. Actually,
So you put it back to the original,
original
mode that
pacemaker.
it
So
was.
actually, they either they do it VOO, or they increase the sensitivity to ignore what's happening in the magnet.
Yeah.
And we have to put it before and after, immediately after.
Also, by the way, what would you do if a patient is going to surgery with a permanent pacemaker on? Then, so at first you check if the patient is pacemaker dependent, and then if he still has escape rhythm but still low. So before starting operation, we change the mode into VOO or DOO, just VOO, and with a rate that is significantly higher than the patient's own rate, so that you do not run into the VF scenario. And then once we are on bypass, and then we want to give cardioplegia, you want to stop the heart. So you actually want to totally stop the pacemaker. So then the pacemaker is again reprogrammed to just stop the pacemaker during the period of cardioplegia, because you want the heart to stop then. Okay, and then after resuming from cardiac arrest, you essentially just pace temporary wears, because this is a lot easier, and then we can adjust the rate in surgery. And then after the patient goes out of theater, the permanent pacing will be put back on. Okay?
Yeah.
Any questions? Thank you.